The whole herbicide aspect of timberland management has changed over the last 20, 30 years. And you think about, the early 70s, late 60s, the Rachel Carson era, a couple of chemicals that were out there that were very harsh chemicals that had a lot of potential environmental damage if nothing else, had a long life in the environment, ran through the food chain. These newer herbicides that have been developed over time are a whole lot different, safer herbicides and more selective. And that's kind of what we're looking at. There's a variety of uses, use herbicides in land management. The way uptake on these chemicals is primarily 3 ways in plants, or really 2 ways. Foliar, strictly on the leaf contact, and is taken up through the vascular system of the plant, and then soil active or systemic chemicals, and they're applied through the soil, and uptake is through the root systems. You're obviously after ultimately trying to kill the root systems of these plants, and in some cases utilizing the herbicide as a chemical barrier to germination. So there's a couple ways to use it. These soil active chemicals make good soil barriers to germination. They'll sit in the soil, as soon as the seed germinates, the plant dies instantly. And obviously the foliar doesn't work that way. You have to get it directly on the leaf for the plant to uptake it. And then formulations, you've got the 3 main types: granular, that can be applied in a granular form directly on the ground, and then it gets rained in. Wettable powders, very common, and obviously liquids is going to be the most common. Main uses for these chemicals in natural resource management, forestry, wildlife type stuff. Site preparation, reforestation after clear cuts, that's probably the most common use of these chemicals, or at least volume-wise, and how much is being used out there, is after a site is cut and ready to be reforested, utilizing herbicides to control vegetation for the first year or 2 until these plants and trees get established. Site preparation of fields, similar to this. In this case, site preparation of fields, like Claude talked about, is controlling the grasses that are growing on site, especially the exotic forage grasses like Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, fescue, that type of thing, whether you're using it for wildlife, getting rid of those grasses for wildlife end, or you're using it for control of those grasses to keep your trees growing. Herbaceous weed control, in most cases, after the trees, pine trees or hardwoods have been planted. Herbaceous weed control keeps that competition off of those trees for an additional year or so, and keeps that site clean and free for that tree to grow. Mid-rotation woody release, we talked about that a little bit. I think everybody's hit on that some. Primarily looking at like sweet gum control in a pine stand. That's after the pines are up and growing, 15 years old, which is indicative of that mid-rotation. Come in and spray out the sweet gums, and that be the woody release. Exotic invasive control, that'll be touched on later on. Nearly all of these treatments have something to do with reducing competition, and primarily on crop trees, trying to get that growth and survival up, get these young trees out of the ground after they've been planted, get them started good. Once they're up and running, they can usually compete on their own pretty well. But it's almost all having something to do with reducing competition on either crop trees or in a woody release. It may have more to do with trying to release the competition off of that understory herbaceous vegetation we're talking about growing. Main types of chemicals that you're dealing with, you got broad spectrum chemicals, glyphosate, picloram, tordon. They basically kill everything that they touch. You spray glyphosate on something, whether it's a sweet gum or a piece of grass, it's going to kill that plant. It may not kill it permanently. In glyphosate, one of the issues with it is some plants it doesn't really effectively kill the root system. Glyphosate is still a fairly benign chemical, even though it does a good job of browning up plants quickly. But it doesn't necessarily outright kill the root systems of most plants. Picloram, the tordon, that one will kill pretty much anything you put it on. And you put a high enough rate on it, you got a sterile site for multiple years. It'll be bare dirt. And you can put pine trees back on it after a year or 2 when it kind of mellowed out a little bit. But picloram is a really tough chemical, and you got to have permits to use that chemical. Herbaceous weeds is another target type of herbicide, and this sulfomet, which is Oust, at least the product name Oust. There's a lot of generics out there, and so I'm using these more common names, but there are generics of just about all these. And the metsulfuron Escort, both of those are targeting herbaceous weeds, dog fennels, goldenrod, ragweed, plants like that, annual plants that typically come up in a clear cut. And these are mostly used for, say you put longleaf in the ground in the wintertime, you come back in the spring and do herbaceous release. Keeps that herbaceous cover, that herbaceous vegetation off the trees for another few months. That's what they're mostly used for. However, Escort especially is a good, it's got some hardwood control aspects. Not all hardwoods are going to be controlled with this chemical, but we use it to some extent for control of hardwoods. So there's overlap between some of these chemicals. This is primarily what it's for, but this one also falls into the hardwood. So grass-specific herbicides, there's a couple of these, and they're pretty tight on grasses. Post, the Sethoxidem, and both the Fusilade as well. These ones pretty much are solidly killing grasses, and do a good job of it. However, something that's tough, like let's say Bermuda grass, tough plant to kill. Bermuda is not going to be controlled with either of these two grass-specific herbicides. You end up having to go more towards Imazapyr. But you know, same thing. Escort, which is a good all-around chemical, even though it's a herbaceous weed chemical, it's a good all-around chemical. Escort does an excellent job on Bahia grass. Probably one of the best chemicals not to kill Bahia grass, even though it doesn't touch Bermuda. So it's real important to know which one of these is going to be specific to the plants you're targeting, or what plants do you have on site that you've got to target with these chemicals. Legume-specific, Transline is a pretty good legume-specific herbicide. You can spray kudzu, for instance, in hardwood areas, and knock the stew out of the kudzu. It's probably not the best kudzu chemical, but it does a pretty good job. Kudzu's a legume. If you got locust problems or other legume-type chemical problem, or legume-type plant problems, Transline's a good one. And then of course hardwood, you know, glyphosate, picloram are good on hardwoods as well. But you know, for hardwood in general, Imazapyr is probably your best. Methods of application is something we talked about earlier. I said I was going to get to. I've just got the main four really here, and 1, 2, 3, 5, or 4, I guess, up there. They're very selective and accurate in most cases. Some of them are more selective than others. Some of them are more accurate than others. You've got to figure out what you're looking at in volume per acre. For instance, you know, site preps are going to be 10 gallons per acre, 15 gallons per acre, somewhere in that ballpark. Obviously, there's some variance. Some of them, you know, some really thick sites, you might want to go 25 GPA. Some really thick pastures, you might want to go 25 GPA. Site prep, the primary use for these herbicides. Historically, the site prep jobs were done with mechanical methods, bulldozers, track hoes, things like that. The problem with them, you got high erosion potential when you start moving that dirt around, breaking the surface of the soil, especially if you're on steeper slopes or gravelly, rocky type dirt that is going to be susceptible to erosion in the first place. You have soil compaction issues on clay dirts with these heavy machinery running over and over and over again, compacts the soil. Topsoil loss, wash it down to the creek systems. It's only short-term weed control. You may remove all the vegetation with that bulldozer, but next year it's going to be back somehow or another. If you remove the root systems, you can get most of these plants off of there, but you know, that's not what a dozer's for, and it's hard to go through and root everything. You can run a root rake, and that'll get a lot of the debris, but still you run that same issue. It's more of a short-term weed control than long-term, and it shifts that vegetation to an annual disturbance type weeds. Drum choppers, another alternative, and still we utilize mechanical and we utilize drum choppers. All depends on the site, but drum chopper was a big item and has been, still is in some cases. It's less soil disturbance, leaves that organic material on site. You see just all just sitting right there, it chops it up a little bit finer, but you still have the problem with soil compaction, you still have the problem with long-term vegetation control. Mulchers, same concept, just a different angle on it. Running through, chewing up this large debris. Makes the site real clean for planting, which is primarily what we use it for now, at least on clear cuts. It's just cleaning it up so it's ready to be planted. Real good debris removal, incorporates a lot of that organic material into the surface, or allows it to rot faster, but still no long-term weed control just with the mulcher. But good touch-up machine for getting ready for planting and spraying if that's what's needed. So, you know, the move towards herbicides, I think, has been a good move in a lot of reasons. But there has been, I think, better wildlife habitat on most of this herbicide application until you get to that point where the pine trees, if that's what's planted, begin to shade out the ground, and then you kind of lose it. But you're going to lose that no matter what. But again, main idea is get control of that competition. Pine and hardwood trees both, as well as the brush. And in most cases, again, this young longleaf, switch that site more to grasses and weeds with the crop trees. Grasses and weeds, especially if you can get the trees away from that first year when they get the root systems established, grasses and weeds aren't going to compete so much for moisture and shade and sunlight as a hardwood tree would, or a brush, or sweet gum, wax myrtle, things like that. They're not going to be, they're going to be more competitive for sunlight and soil moisture than grasses and weeds are. Plus, excellent strategy for wildlife until these crop trees shade out the ground. Herbaceous weed control, this is a good example of longleaf plantation put in the ground and followed behind with herbaceous weed control on a clear cut. Because when you do this, you have a follow-up crew has to go through, or mechanical, however you're going to do it, has to apply that chemical a second time, which in most cases is going to run you from 20 to 40 bucks an acre to apply a second chemical application. Releases mid-rotation, again going back to that same slide, you can see these gum over here, pine stand over the top, and then the stand unmanaged on the left-hand side. Typically used for sweet gum control, although oak sprouts, popcorn trees, privet, all the other junk that you might have out there can be targeted. Pre-spray, this was going back to that first picture, just a different spot in that stand. It doesn't look as heavily stocked. These sweet gums right here, they're just crying out for a Mazapir to be sprayed on them. I mean, I just love looking at a sweet gum stand like that because it is solid. This was one of the heaviest infestations of sweet gum, but this had just been thinned. You see the blue paint. Had just been thinned a year before, had a whole summer to grow. The loggers, we didn't even have to run a mulcher in there to speak of. We did a little bit, but not much. Loggers did a really good job of cleaning that site off and getting all that small saplings out of there. And these sweet gums were all about 4 or 5 foot tall. There might have been a couple 6-footers out there coming back from those root stalks. You know, if they're this big around, they got a nice big top with lots of leaves, healthy and green and happy, they're just asking for a good shot of a Mazapir. And in this case, they got it. That's the way I like to see it, because that was the following spring after. Again, we're talking about these selective herbicides. I just find it fascinating, you know, all the different uses for some of these things. And, you know, uses where you can plant one type and not hurt another type. So in this case, native warm season grasses. You can see the drilled rows of this broom sedge, Indian grass type of mix right here, and the herbicide over the top of it. Another one of the BASF Mazapir that just burns back just about everything except these little native warm season grasses. I think that's just cool as can be. You can multiple spray over the top of stuff like that if you use the right chemicals. So, you know, is it worth it? I mean, it's all relative to each individual landowner and their objectives. Obviously, when you look straight at site prep spraying, yeah, there's no question about it. From a growth standpoint, getting your pine trees up and growing and making you money as quickly as possible down the road is definitely worth it from a financial standpoint. You start talking about mid-story, woody control. This stand used to have a full understory of sweet gums. Not anymore, you know. It's an older longleaf stand, and, you know, broom straw, wonderful wildlife habitat. And, you know, the landowner himself has got to answer those questions of whether the money they spent on this and doing any clearing work and the regular burning, you know, made it worthwhile to utilize, you know, chemicals in this case.